My name is Rosie. I am speaking to you from Kaurna land, which is where I live and work and have done so for much of my life. I live here as a direct beneficiary of colonisation, and the sovereignty of this land has never been ceded. The culture and connection of Kaurna people is alive and well, so it's important that I work to tread lightly on this land. And I think that decolonisation should be always a part of queer practices. I'm really indebted to First Nations narrative practitioners who've invited me into decolonising practice, and I hope that those ideas can inform and support me to dislodge ideas of white supremacy that have infiltrated a lot of LGBT movements and spaces. So that's the place that I wanted to start this from. I also want to acknowledge some of the other people whose shoulders I'm standing on and who've been walking alongside me, without whom none of my work would be possible. And I want to acknowledge anyone who might be watching this for whom this is personal. So if you're a person of queer experience, or if you love someone who is, this might have a different meaning for you. So I really hope that I can hold you in watching this. Acknowledging politics and power sits at the centre of my work, and it starts with me paying close attention to my social location in relation to the people that I work with, and that can shift and change all the time. Some of the things that change less are that I'm white, I'm thin, non-religious, able-bodied, neurotypical, and I have access to significant class privilege, so I'm paying close attention to how that influences my conversations with people. I might describe myself as a gender-resisting, non-binary femme person, but I'm not transgender. I am, however, indebted to my trans-masculine partner for a peripheral lived experience of some of the discourses and systems that affect the lives of trans folks. At 30, I'm youngish. I often sit in between the young people that I work with and their loved ones, although young people like to frequently remind me that I'm not a young person, which is reinforced when they say things like mood, and I have no idea what they're saying. If you don't know what I just said, might mean that you're not a young person either. Sorry to break that to you. So in my work with queer young people, I have sometimes got some insider knowledge that can shape our conversations in really generative ways, but I also always hold many layers of power and privilege on top of the power that I hold as a therapist, so I have to be extra vigilant to avoid making assumptions of shared experience or inadvertently prescribing what it means to be a queer person. When curiosity departs, doors to alternative stories close, and it becomes a lot less possible to learn about what is unknown, to move away from what is known and familiar. Sometimes it's really, really important for me to knowingly laugh at an L-word reference. And for those that don't know, that's a really trashy American lesbian sitcom. It's a bit of a cult fave. But often, instead of going, yeah, it's actually more important that I ask a question. What does the word queer, transition, butch mean to you? Is that okay? Not okay? A mix of both. My suspicion is that what is often more valuable than my queerness is my awareness of and attention to the discourses that touch the lives of queer folks in terms of how that informs my practice. Last year, Cheryl and David called me with a pretty wild idea about creating a counselling service for queer young people here in Adelaide on Kaurna land. That was the beginning of a project called Our Place, which created the context for me to do some of this work that I'm calling queer invitations. One of the things that they thought that would be really important was that this service would be a relations service, which invited loved ones into conversations with queer young people. And I agreed, but I was also conflicted. I'd been working in the LGBTIQ sector for a while, and I'd been recruited into scarcity and binaries of us and them. And I'd hear parents talking about how they wished someone had been there to support them when their child was coming out. And I'd be there thinking, there's barely any services for your child. Where should you be getting support? I also really struggled to imagine how I could be compassionate and curious to family members who were expressing homophobic or transphobic views. But soon after we began having these conversations, I went to a conference in Melbourne where 3 migrant Chinese parents spoke about their experience of their kids coming out as gay. One of their stories in particular caught my attention. Pamela Fock said that for a few months after her son came out, I went into mourning, I cried day and night. The son I knew was dead. I was also very scared that he would be ridiculed, that he would frequent gay bars and have sex with lots of people and die of AIDS or an overdose. I also felt fear of ridicule. I went into the closet at the time that Tim walked out of it. I was hoping that an accident would happen to my family so no one would ever know this secret. Hearing her speak, I could really clearly see the way that homophobia was intersecting with the racism and xenophobia experienced by their family, as well as the gendered pressures on mothers and women. And she spoke to us, a room full of mostly queer people, and told us that she had campaigned with her church against homosexuality. And then, crying, she said to us, "I want to say to all of you here, I'm sorry." Pretty much everyone in the room was sobbing at this point, including me. She spoke about perseverance and many awkward family conversations, and that she now regards herself as part of the rainbow community. This was a really profound invitation for me. I began reflecting differently on all of the parents of queer children that I know, including my own, and I felt more able to externalise homophobia and transphobia rather than locating it in the bodies of people who were expressing it. It generated for me a really strong commitment to inviting loved ones into therapeutic conversations with queer young people, and that's gone on to shape my work in quite a profound way. The word queer is a complex one, and right now I'm not using it as an umbrella term for lesbian, gay, bisexual, intersex and transgender, but to describe people and acts which transgress, fail at, reject and resist norms around sex, gender, sexuality, relationships, family and bodies. So this is less about identity and more about experience of and relationship with norms. I want to stress that the term queer still carries a really heavy history of homophobic and transphobic violence for some, and I wouldn't ever describe an individual as queer unless they describe themselves that way. So when I meet with young people in my work, I ask them, what kind of word do you use to describe yourself at the moment? By saying at the moment or mentioning, I know these things can shift and change, I try to make sure to visibilise that it's okay if the language they use to describe themselves changes, or if there aren't any words that feel like they fit well. I also sometimes directly ask, how do you feel about the word queer? And ultimately, I'm taking the lead from them about what words they use to describe themselves and make sure that I keep checking in about whether that changes. To queer something is an emergent process of disrupting expected norms in such a way that new possibilities emerge and standard unquestioned practices become open for interrogation. Colonial heteropatriarchal discourses affect everyone, not just queer people, so a queer lens informs all of my work. But it can do so in different ways depending on who I'm working with. Many LGBT people do not identify with or necessarily think in queer ways, a bit like how not all women identify with feminism. One of the ways that queer people have resisted oppression has been by claiming discourses that were used against them, which is known as reverse discourse. So it was said that we were unnatural, choosing to be gay, that we're sexually deviant. So we said, well, we're born this way and we fight for marriage equality and we try to prove that we're just as natural and normal as straight people. But all the while, we're reinforcing that those ways of being are normal and superior. And that's what we call homonormativity or transnormativity. So there are loads of ideas within LGBT movements and cultures like this, which have contributed to LGBT movements making monumental gains, but which also rely on biological essentialism, replicate heterosexuality, and reinforce binary notions of gender. They normalise queers rather than destabilising norms. None of these ideas are inherently problematic or harmful. They provide frameworks through which many queer people, including myself, have been able to access a sense of legitimate personhood, belonging, connection, safety, community. However, the dominance of these ideas can mean that complying with them is required in order to access those things. So some of us receive a ticket into acceptability, while many others, fat queers, disabled queers, non-binary people, queer and trans people of colour, kinky poly, gender fucking queers, get further pushed to the margins. These ideas can also have us policing ourselves for not performing queerness properly. As narrative therapists, we're also interested in questioning dominant discourses which privilege some while marginalising others, in poking holes in internal states or static notions of identity, which are totalising and reduce possibilities for alternative stories and movement. So maybe you have a sense of why I believe that queer theory and narrative practice are made for each other. In my experience, narrative practice is a string of invitations. These invitations are curious and require the practitioner to imagine where conversations might go, which directions might be useful, while remaining open to unexpected possibilities. They're vigilant to the effects they may have on a person, both if they're taken up and if they're not. They're tentative and collaborative and attend to power relations and the politics of consent. And they're informed by post-structuralist feminist ideas. But they also avoid imposing those ideas by using a decentered but influential therapeutic posture. So queer invitations are simply narrative invitations which are also informed by queer theory. Queer invitations poke holes in things that seem more solid than they are and hopefully give people room to move. They make visible the operations of rigid constructs of gender and heteronormativity that operate in all of our lives and endeavour to connect people with a sense of agency in relating to those norms. And they require the use of non-binary superpowers. So non-binary superpowers was an idea that was introduced to me by Munya and Indy at the master's program last year. Using non-binary superpowers means that I can trouble, destabilise, challenge, expand fixed and essentialist notions of identity while honouring the way that identity and recognition of identity can support a sense of belonging and personhood. I can avoid dichotomies and instead invite into conversations multiple ideas and stories which can coexist whether or not they seem contradictory, which is something that we as narrative practitioners do all the time through double listening and through eliciting multi-storied accounts of people's lives. So now I'm going to share a few brief examples of how this looks in my practice. So talking about pronouns. Many of the gender diverse young people that I work with prefer different pronouns or names in different circumstances with different people. Others are happy for me to use the name and pronoun that they've always gone by. And often how people want to be referred to when I first meet them might change. So when I'm speaking to loved ones, when a parent calls me for the first time, I have to be really careful to avoid assumptions, and I tend to avoid using gendered language until I have a sense of 1, what pronouns the young person prefers, 2, what their loved one's position on using those pronouns is, and 3, what the young person's position on their parents or me using a particular pronoun might be. So it's a lot less important for me to know the gender the young person identifies as or what gender they were assigned at birth than to know how they want to be spoken about and to. And I want to be inviting people into the practice of naming and speaking about pronouns because it's new and strange to most people. So we've been using intake forms which ask everyone to identify their pronouns, which may mean that loved ones have their first experience of being asked their pronouns, allowing them to notice this taken for granted privilege. When a loved one expresses an intention to begin using their child's preferred name or pronouns, I'm really interested in what values or hopes of theirs this might speak to. And I also want to check in about whether our conversations might support the project of using a new name or pronoun. I really want to avoid inviting shame into the room for parents and other loved ones around getting pronouns wrong, which is known as misgendering, because shame can get in the way of learning new names and pronouns and can collude with discourses of parental and especially maternal blame, which invites defensiveness. Also, an extremely common experience of trans folks is having to respond to other people's shame around misgendering them. So that's emotional labour on top of transgression, which certainly does not foster connection, on top of being a double injustice. Instead, I might ask family questions like, what are the things that do or might support you to practice using a new name or new pronouns? What could get in the way of using the right name and pronouns? What would you be saying to other parents who are beginning to use new name or pronouns? Now I'm going to talk a bit about relational inquiries. Whether or not other people are in the room, I want to always be asking relational questions which make visible the way that loved ones participate in co-constructing each other's sense of self and which invite accountability. I often try to ask parents early on in the conversation to tell me about their hopes for their child's life, for their family, for their relationship with their child, and also about the values that guide their parenting and the history of how those values came to be. Having these kinds of conversations can make it a lot more possible for me to then inquire about how fear, grief, discomfort, or other things that they might be contending with have them acting in ways that don't align with their preferred ways of parenting. When I've asked parents at the end what stood out about our conversations, they've often told me that they found the most useful questions the ones that had them thinking about how their child was experiencing things. So that's quite interesting to me. With queer young people, I want to ask about which people or spaces most affirm their queerness. Who do they feel most seen by? And what is it that others know or appreciate about them that some people might miss? I want to know who or what is it that's made it possible for them to develop their understanding of or relationship with masculinity, femininity, gender. Some of the young people that I work with have incredibly sophisticated, detailed, extensive knowledge about the operations of gender and discourses, and they might be 13 years old. How did they come to learn these things? It's mind-blowing. I often hear about gender-resisting family members, K-pop artists, RuPaul's Drag Race, queer Instagrammers, characters in books, Harry Potter, queer drop-in spaces. So I want to know, what is it about these people, places, communities that affirms their sense of personhood and make that visible just as much as I want to make visible the kind of discrimination that undermines it. And I also want to know what the young people are doing to invite these experiences of affirmation into their lives. What did it take to gather the courage to attend a queer community event, to seek out and post in a trans forum on Discord, or to create a culture in a friendship group where it's okay to be who you are? When young people are consulting me about homophobia or transphobia showing up in their home, I also want to be drawing out multi-storied accounts of their loved ones. One young trans woman I work with, whose parents felt their religious beliefs meant it wasn't possible to affirm her gender, told me, "I don't want anyone to give them a firm talking to. It wouldn't be fair justice on them." I was kind of taken aback, but I asked her what she would want for her parents, and she said, right now, them being able to talk about how they feel is fair enough. And these expressions really held me accountable when I was meeting with her parents and invited me to hold on to curiosity and compassion and creating a space where they were able to talk about how they feel. I want to be using my non-binary superpowers to avoid getting drawn into dichotomies of parents and family members being supportive or unsupportive, And I also want to consult young people about what they think their loved one's actions or responses might speak to, and what they think might be getting in the way of their parents using a preferred name or pronouns. So now I'm going to talk a bit about resisting the pathologization of gender diverse young people. The dominant understanding of trans experiences in Australia, as in many places in the world, is pathologized, as homosexuality once was. A gender dysphoria diagnosis is required for anyone wanting to access hormone replacement therapy, surgery, or puberty blockers. So in order to access these services, trans folk are required to prove that they experience clinically significant distress or impairment, and often are required to prove that they reject or disassociate from things that supposedly align with the gender they're assigned at birth. This pathology has created an incredibly strong single story of what it means to be a trans person, which conveniently locates the problem in the bodies of trans people rather than in the context of their lives or in rigid prescriptive constructs of gender and heteronormativity. If you're not struggling with gender, then you're not a real trans person is an idea that's familiar to all of the gender resisting young people I work with. And I'm sure you've probably seen media depictions of trans lives characterised by anguish and struggle. This story and the pathologised understanding of transness regulates who might be able to claim transness and how it's performed. And it can recruit trans folks into policing themselves and each other. Ollie, a non-binary young person I work with, told me in a letter they wrote to me about how this story had impacted on their life. They said, "I felt like I wanted to reject everything, and all of these emotions, as well as my mental health and relationship with my family, fall exactly into the suicidal trans kid storyline. This was the most negative gender idea I took on, that non-conformity goes hand in hand with unhappiness and pain. It creeped into every crack in my mind, and I'm still struggling to scrub it out." Trans folks, like Ollie, are always resisting the influence of this idea, and I want to be able to create opportunities for young people to describe rich, diverse, alternative stories about what it means to be a trans person. One 13-year-old told me that he too had heard many stories about trans people being sad. And when I asked him if that's the only story we hear about trans people, what might get missed, he told me there are lots of good parts of their stories, like the first time I got my hair cut, or getting my name changed at school, or getting called by the right gender in public. When young people speak to me about wanting a diagnosis, I want to ask questions that bring forward their agency in navigating the medical system, that enable them to richly describe their hopes for their lives connected to accessing surgery or hormones, and that can expose the transphobia and transnormativity that's embedded in the medical system. So I have to use my non-binary superpowers to invite young people to stand outside of and question gender dysphoria while supporting them to seek that diagnosis. I also hope to be able to provide a space where it's possible to express doubt or concern about surgery or hormones without fear that this will jeopardise their access to those services, and to position them as experts who ultimately know best, and definitely better than psychologists and psychiatrists, about their own bodies. Externalising gender dysphoria, separating the problem from the person, enables deconstruction and also supports trans folks to be in dialogue with gender dysphoria rather than defined by it. I've also found that the term gender dysphoria has been so popularised that there's a sense that it has a universal understanding and people have really different experiences of it. So I want to be able to enable people to name the particulars of their own experience of gender dysphoria. So I proposed the idea of externalising gender dysphoria to Morgan, who identifies as non-binary, and their mum Kate. I started out by explaining a bit about externalising practices and asked whether they would be up for trying it. I wanted to be transparent about the practice and make the theory that underlies it available to them in the hopes that they may continue jointly externalising gender dysphoria outside of our conversations. And they decided they would be up for it. The conversation that followed was shaped by Michael White's statement of position map 1. And hopefully you can follow along. I asked Morgan if they would be able to draw gender dysphoria on the whiteboard, which they did, And I checked in about whether it was even called gender dysphoria or maybe it was called something else. And I was surprised to find out that this character was actually called Ghosty Boy. And that Ghosty Boy used she, her pronouns. Morgan uses they, them. I was interested in when she first showed up in Morgan's life and found out that this happened during puberty. I asked when she was loudest and most present, and I learnt that sometimes she shouted at Morgan and other times she whispered, but she hung around pretty consistently. We zeroed in on when it was that she shouted, when Morgan was doing feminine things or in a place where they're not out, and when she whispered, when Morgan wears stuff with pink on it, puts their weight on one leg, or talks with their hands. The shouting and the whispering also had different effects, including changing Morgan's behaviour, making them feel like garbage, and having them question, am I actually a trans person? Interestingly, sometimes Ghosty Boy would go quiet, but even when that happened, the lack of distress of apparent gender dysphoria had Morgan questioning whether that might mean they weren't a real trans person. Remember before how I was talking about gender dysphoria legitimising people's transness? Throwback to that conversation. Anyway, I asked about what Ghosty Boy wanted or intended for Morgan's life and where she got her ideas and beliefs from. Morgan told me that she wanted them to either be a binary trans guy or a cis woman, choose one. And she was most supported in her self-righteous commitment that this would be best for Morgan by some of Morgan's distant cisgender family, by random people on the internet, by the gender binary, and whenever people didn't use Morgan's pronouns, they, them. When Morgan would get misgendered, Ghosty Boy would say, see, they agree with me. That was the exact voice. And I asked how Morgan would respond to Ghosty Boy. And they told me they would shout back, fuck off, you're wrong, I'm not a woman and I'm not a man. It really wasn't a surprise to me that Ghosty Boy's beliefs conflicted quite a bit with Morgan's own. I'd heard many stories that showed me that they're a passionate advocate for diversity and binary resistance, and that they always trust people are who they say they are without expecting them to prove it. They told me that in spite of Ghosty Boy's attempts to persuade them otherwise, they know they don't need a certificate from a professional to prove that they're a trans person. They know that they're non-binary, they know themselves better than a psychologist. And after learning so much about Ghosty Boy, Morgan told me that they were okay with her being around, and it seemed like she didn't have the same influence she used to, and that they know that she's wrong. At the end of this conversation, Kate, who'd been listening in, said that she understood a lot more about gender dysphoria's influence in Morgan's life. So that's a brief introduction to some of the queer invitational practices I've been using. Others include writing letters to loved ones to invite them to join conversations with me and queer young people, collective conversations and collective documents that sponsor diverse narratives of non-binary lives, invitations to deconstruct the many discourses that show up in conversations with queer young people and their families, and using therapeutic letters to capture stories of collaboration between young people and their loved ones, especially in resisting homophobia and transphobia in their lives. The therapeutic conversations that I get to take part of are all collaborations. They shape me as they shape the people that I'm working with. And at the same time that I'm making queer invitations, I'm receiving them. I'm being invited into new ideas, knowledge, language, and culture. And I'm often invited to question many of my own taken for granted assumptions and beliefs, and to notice when my non-binary superpowers have departed and when I've been captured by totalizing discourses, which happens all the time. I thought I would finish up with one of my favourite quotes from Ollie, which I think pretty much sums up why I do the work the way that I do. So I'll leave you with that. Thanks for listening.